The neighborhood had always been quiet, in a comforting way. Most days, the only sounds were children riding their bikes, birds settling on the trees, and the distant hum of someone mowing their lawn. For the person living in the small corner house, with the trimmed hedges and worn-out welcome mat, life followed a simple rhythm. They liked coming home from work, putting their keys in the same dish by the door, and enjoying a slow walk around the block before sunset. Nothing exciting ever happened there, and that was exactly how they preferred it. But over time, something in the air began to change. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't loud. It was small things. At first, a new sign placed at the entrance, reminding everyone about proper exterior standards. Notice left on someone's door about a trash can being visible from the street. A warning given to a neighbor over a tiny flower pot left near their mailbox. People brushed it off, saying the HOA was tightening rules, but nothing to worry about. Still, the feeling grew. Conversations in the evenings became whispers. People spoke only after checking over their shoulders, as if afraid a board member might step out from behind a fence. Nobody liked the direction things were heading, but nobody wanted to get into trouble either. Most residents just wanted peace, and peace sometimes meant not arguing. One afternoon, after returning from work, the homeowner noticed an envelope tucked into the door. It wasn't a regular mail envelope, but a printed sheet folded neatly, marked with the HOAS logo. At first, they didn't think much of it. Maybe it was a reminder for a community event or a general announcement, but when they opened it, their eyebrows lifted. It was a violation notice. According to the paper, the homeowner had broken a neighborhood rule. The problem? A small decorative item placed near the front porch. Something so ordinary and harmless that most people walking by probably didn't even notice it. The paper said it was out of compliance, but didn't explain why. It felt strange, unnecessary, and even a little insulting. The homeowner sat on the porch steps, reading the notice twice, then a third time. Nothing about it made sense. The decoration had been there for months. Nobody had complained, and there were dozens of houses with similar items in their yards. For a moment, they thought of ignoring it. After all, it wasn't a big fine or anything serious, just a warning. But something about the tone of the letter didn't sit right. It seemed cold, almost threatening in a formal way, and the idea of getting more notices in the future felt unsettling, so they decided to reach out to the HOA office. The number listed on the letter went straight to voicemail. They left a message. No call came back. They tried again the next day. Still nothing. They sent an email, politely asking for clarification. Hours passed. Then a day. Then two. The silence felt intentional. Meanwhile, the neighborhood continued its usual routine. People watered their lawns, checked their mail, waved politely to passing cars. But the homeowner noticed that nearly everyone kept their heads down a little more than before. A neighbor trimming their bushes mentioned that they also got a warning recently for something as simple as a garden hose that wasn't rolled up tightly enough. Another neighbor complained about being told their fence paint was slightly faded, even though it looked perfectly fine. Everyone had a story now, and each story made the homeowners notice. It felt less like a one-time mistake and more like part of a bigger problem. One evening, during a walk around the block, the homeowner passed by a group of neighbors chatting outside. They spoke about how the HOA meetings had become tense. Questions were being brushed aside. Decisions were being made without much explanation. Some people wanted to challenge the board, but nobody wanted to be the first. Something about that conversation lingered in the homeowner's mind. They had always avoided conflict, but this wasn't just about a decoration. It was about feeling powerless in a place that was supposed to feel like home. Later that night, they found the notice again and read it slowly. The calmer they tried to feel, the more irritated they became. Not because of the decoration, but because of the lack of clarity. If they were truly breaking a rule, they deserved to know why. If not, then the notice was unfair. After sitting quietly in their living room for a long moment, they made a decision. They would attend the next HOA meeting. They didn't intend to start an argument or cause drama. They just wanted answers. They wanted someone on the board to look them in the eye and explain what rule had been broken. It seemed like a simple request, something any reasonable person could understand. The meeting was set for the following week. Normally, The homeowner would have ignored the announcement posted near the community entrance. But now it felt important, necessary. In the days leading up to the meeting, they couldn't help but notice the neighborhood in a different light. The new rule signs, the cautious way people spoke, the quiet frustration hiding behind polite smiles. It was as if the homes were the same, but the feeling of community had been replaced by something colder when the day finally arrived. The homeowner left the house early, wanting to find a good seat and observe everything calmly. They expected a few people to show up, maybe the usual small group who always volunteered or attended. But when they walked into the meeting room, they were surprised. The room was full. Neighbors of all ages were seated, some talking quietly, others staring at the front table where the HOA board members sat. The atmosphere felt thick, like a room waiting for something to happen. As the homeowner took their seat, they heard whispers from behind. They better explain themselves today. I'm tired of getting notices for nothing. They're going too far now. It became clear that the homeowner wasn't alone. Many people were frustrated. Many had been waiting for this meeting to finally speak up. The HOA board entered with confident expressions, holding clipboards and files. They didn't seem nervous, only busy, almost too calm for a room full of concerned residents. When the meeting started, the board members jumped straight into their agenda as if nothing was wrong. They talked about landscaping, parking guidelines, and scheduled maintenance, all normal things. But the tension in the room didn't go away. The homeowner sat patiently, waiting for the moment when residents could speak. Their heart beat harder than expected. They weren't used to standing up in rooms like this. They weren't loud or confrontational. But something inside them pushed forward. When the time finally came for residents to bring up their concerns, a few people hesitated before raising their hands. The homeowner's hand lifted too, slowly but firmly. They were ready to ask the simple question that had been bothering them from the moment they opened that letter. Why? Why was the notice sent? What rule had been broken? Why was the HOA acting like this toward the people they were supposed to serve? Little did they know that single question would lead to something much bigger. Something nobody in the room was prepared for, and the confrontation waiting to unfold at. That meeting would take a turn they never saw coming. The room felt heavier once the time came for residents to speak. People shifted in their chairs, cleared their throats, and looked at one another for a signal to go first. It was as if everyone had something to say, but no one wanted to be the first voice to break the uneasy silence. The homeowner sat there with their heart beating faster than usual. They weren't the kind of person who jumped into conflicts, but they also knew they couldn't walk away without asking the question that had been bothering them all week. Finally, a resident from the back stood up. He spoke about receiving a violation for something minor, like a small crack in the driveway that had been there long before any rule about it existed. Another person talked about being told to repaint their mailbox because the color looked slightly faded, even though it looked perfectly fine. Story after story came out. What had once been whispers among neighbors now filled the entire room. The board members listened with stiff expressions. They nodded occasionally, but their faces stayed unreadable. It was hard to tell whether they were paying attention or just waiting for everyone to finish so they could move on. Then it was the homeowner's turn. They stood up slowly, feeling dozens of eyes turned toward them. They took a quiet breath and held the violation notice in their hand. Their voice was calm, not angry. It's just steady. They explained that they had received a notice for a small decoration near their porch. Nothing dangerous, nothing messy, nothing that bothered anyone. They asked why it was considered a problem. They mentioned the attempts to call, the unanswered voicemail, the ignored emails. The room fell quiet. People listened closely because many of them had gone through similar situations. It felt like the homeowner was speaking for more than just themselves. One of the board members finally responded. He adjusted his glasses and said the violation was likely part of standard enforcement. A vague answer that didn't explain anything. The homeowner waited for more details, but nothing came. Another board member chimed in, saying rules were rules and the community had to follow them. The homeowner nodded respectfully, but asked again. This time a little more firmly, what specific rule did I break? They held the notice up as if offering it for inspection. The board members looked at each other. One shuffled some papers. Another tapped her pen on the desk. It was clear they didn't have a clear answer ready. Instead of addressing the question, one board member shifted the topic, saying that the community needed to maintain a certain standard of appearance and consistency. The answer sounded rehearsed, like something copied from a handbook. It didn't address the issue at all. The homeowner stayed patient. They weren't looking for an argument, only an explanation. They simply asked again, "Can you show me which rule applies to this?" They pointed to the item mentioned in the notice. The board's faces tightened. A few neighbors murmured quietly. One resident near the front spoke up suddenly and said, "I got a notice just like that last month. They never explained mine either." His voice carried frustration, but also relief that someone else was finally asking the same questions. Another neighbor, an older woman with soft gray hair, added that she'd been threatened with fines for a harmless wind chime she'd had for years. The board had claimed it was too reflective, whatever that meant. More voices rose, each one sharing a story of confusion, worry, or unfair treatment. The board's calm expressions started to crack. It was clear they hadn't expected this kind of pushback. Finally, the board president lifted his hand to quiet the room. He said that the board was simply following procedures and that all actions were aligned with the community's best interests. But the residents weren't satisfied. The words sounded empty, like something said to avoid real accountability. The homeowner spoke again, gently but clearly, asking if they could see the rulebook or any written guideline that supported their violation. The request was simple and reasonable, but the board president replied that the documents were not immediately available and would need to be reviewed internally before being shown to residents. This caused another stir in the room. Many residents exchanged confused looks. One person near the back said loudly, "Shouldn't the rules be available to everyone? How are we supposed to follow them if we can't see them?" The room echoed with agreement. The board members stiffened. They didn't seem prepared for a room full of people questioning them. The usual calm, predictable meetings were clearly over, as the frustration in the room grew. The homeowner tried to steer the conversation back to clarity. They weren't trying to accuse anyone. They just wanted transparency. They said the violation felt unfair, and that being ignored for days made it worse. At that moment, an unexpected thing happened. A resident who had been silent the entire time, an older gentleman with a cane, stood up slowly. The room seemed to quiet out of respect, or maybe curiosity. He had lived in the neighborhood longer than almost everyone else. He spoke softly, but with a voice that carried across the room. He said he had seen many HOA boards over the years, but he had never seen so many residents afraid to speak up. He said something had changed in the way the board handled things. Too many notices, too many vague reasons, too many unanswered questions. His words seemed to hit the board harder than any complaint before. They shifted uncomfortably. The president leaned forward, frowning. Before the board could respond, more residents added to the conversation. Some said they felt targeted. Others said they felt pressured. One woman said she had cried after receiving a notice, because she feared being fined even though she had no idea what she'd done wrong. The homeowner listened quietly. Realizing that this meeting was much bigger than their own issue, the room had gone from individual frustrations to a shared concern. Something had built up over time. Now it was spilling out. The board president tried to regain control by suggesting that residents submit their concerns in writing and wait for formal responses. But the room reacted strongly to that. People had already tried writing, calling, emailing, and had received nothing. The homeowner spoke once more, their voice steady and calm. They said all anyone wanted was clear communication. They said rules should be fair, consistent, and explained properly. If the board claimed a standard, then they needed to show it. The room agreed with nods and a low ripple of support. A board member finally snapped a little, saying the board was overwhelmed and doing the best it could. But instead of calming the room, the comment only drew more attention. A resident near the middle raised her hand and asked why new notices had suddenly become so frequent in the past months. She said she had lived there for years without a single warning. Now she had received 3. Another man asked why the board refused to share. Certain financial reports during the last meeting? The room grew even quieter at this question. Financial issues were something many residents had wondered about, but hadn't voiced out loud. The board president stared at a stack of papers in front of him but didn't answer. The tension grew. People could feel it. Something was off, and the board's silence only made it more obvious. Finally, the homeowner did something simple. They asked again, "Can we see the guidelines?" "That's all I want." Their voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The board members exchanged a long, uneasy look. They whispered among themselves for a moment, flipping through folders as if searching for something. But the longer they searched, the more nervous they seemed. It became clear to everyone in the room that they didn't have a straightforward answer. The board president cleared his throat and said the documents were under revision, a new excuse that nobody had heard before. Residents murmured in disbelief. Someone said, "So you gave out violations based on rules that aren't even finalized?" The question hung in the air like a spotlight. The board president's face tightened. Another board member looked down at her hands. The homeowner didn't speak again after that. They simply sat down and listened, watching as the room's energy shifted. People who had once been quiet were now raising their hands, demanding clarity, demanding access to documents, demanding answers. The board struggled to keep control. Their voices grew sharp at times, defensive at others. They tried to move the meeting forward. Residents kept circling back to the same concerns. Something had changed in the room. The fear that once kept people silent had turned into unity. People realized they weren't alone, and that gave them strength. As the meeting went on, the board members became more visibly tense. They promised to send emails, to schedule reviews, to look into issues. But the residents didn't seem satisfied. They wanted real answers, not promises that would fade once the meeting ended. Toward the end, a resident suggested forming a committee of neighbors to review the board's decisions. The idea sparked a wave of agreement. People liked the idea of being involved, of bringing fairness back into the neighborhood. The board president resisted, saying decisions had to remain within the board's authority. But the room no longer accepted vague explanations. By the time the meeting ended, the board members looked drained, and the residents looked determined. The homeowner walked out of the room slowly, feeling the cool night air hit their face. They didn't feel triumphant, just relieved. They had finally spoken up. They had asked the question, and even though the board hadn't given answers, something important had happened. People had united. The simple act of raising their hand had opened the door for others to speak. The neighborhood wasn't silent anymore, and even though no one could predict what would happen next, it was clear that things had changed. The confrontation had only begun, and the next part of the story was already taking shape. Even if no one could see it yet, the morning after the meeting, the neighborhood felt different. It wasn't something a person could see right away, but it was something they could feel. People who usually rushed inside after checking their mail now lingered a little longer. Neighbors whose conversations were once short and polite began talking more openly. There was a quiet understanding in the air everyone knew. The meeting had changed something. The homeowner stepped outside with a cup of tea, expecting the usual calm morning scene. But instead, they saw two neighbors standing at the edge of the sidewalk, talking in hushed but animated voices. When they noticed the homeowner, they waved them over. "What happened yesterday?" one of them said, shaking their head. "It needed to happen." Another neighbor nodded. "I've never seen the board that uncomfortable. They didn't know how to handle us speaking up." The homeowner listened, surprised that people who usually stayed quiet were now so willing to talk. It felt like something fragile but important had been unlocked, something that had been waiting under the surface for months. Throughout the day, more residents approached the homeowner, thanking them for speaking up. Some shared stories of notices they hadn't told anyone about. One woman said she had felt judged for weeks because she didn't understand why she kept receiving warnings. Another man said he had been scared to argue with the board because he didn't want trouble. The homeowner realized that their simple question at the meeting had given people permission to finally voice their feelings. It wasn't about being bold. It was about being tired of staying silent. Later that afternoon, the homeowner decided to go for a walk, partly to clear their mind and partly to see how others were feeling. As they made their way down the street, they saw a group of people gathered in front of a house. They approached to check if something was wrong. It turned out that a resident had received yet another warning letter. It's time for supposedly having excessive foliage in their yard. Everyone looking at the yard agreed there was nothing wrong with it. The bushes were neatly trimmed, and the grass was cut. The only unusual thing was the timing it arrived. Just a day after the heated meeting. It's like they're trying to prove a point, someone whispered. Or maybe they're trying to scare us. Another person suggested. The homeowner stood there quietly, feeling a sense of unease settle in their stomach. It didn't make sense for the HOA to act even more aggressively right after being called out. Unless, maybe, they were trying to remind residents who held the power. The group talked for several minutes before dispersing. The homeowner continued their walk, but now their mind was unsettled. Something about the timing felt wrong that evening. Just as the sun dipped behind the roofs of the houses, the homeowner received a knock on their door. When they opened it, they found the older gentleman from the meeting, the one who had spoken with quiet authority. He greeted the homeowner politely, asked if they had a moment. They sat on the porch together, the air cool and still. "I wanted to thank you for speaking up yesterday," the man began. "Many of us have been dealing with this for too long." The homeowner nodded, humbled. "I wasn't trying to start anything. I just wanted clarity. But it seems like there's much more going on." The man sighed, his eyes reflecting years of observation. This isn't the first time the board has acted like this, but lately things have gotten worse." He explained that several months ago, changes had been made to the board without a public vote. Some longtime members had quietly stepped down, and new members had taken their places with little explanation. Notices became more frequent. Residents were discouraged from asking questions, and anytime someone complained, they were told to submit their concerns in writing, which often led to no response at all. The homeowner listened carefully. They had suspected something was wrong. But hearing it from someone who had lived there for decades made it more real. The older man continued. "Something else has been bothering me. A few weeks ago, I requested to see the financial statements, as is allowed under the community rules. But I was told the documents were being updated and weren't available yet. That's not normal." The homeowner felt a chill run through them. "Do you think something is happening with the funds?" The man shrugged, but his eyes suggested suspicion. "I don't know. But I've lived here long enough to know when something feels off." Before they could discuss more, a car slowly rolled past the house. The driver didn't wave or smile, just stared at them through the window. The older man glanced at the homeowner with a knowing. "Look, that's one of the newer board members," he whispered. The car turned the corner and disappeared. The homeowner felt a strange mix of discomfort and determination. They had entered this situation because of a simple notice. But now the pieces of a larger picture were coming together, and it was becoming harder to ignore after the older man left. The homeowner sat on the porch for a long time, thinking about everything they had heard. They didn't want drama. They didn't want to fight. But they also didn't want to live in a place where people were afraid to speak. The next day, something unexpected happened. A handwritten note was slipped under the homeowner's door. It wasn't signed. The handwriting was slightly shaky, like the person had been nervous while writing. The note read, "Thank you for standing up yesterday. You're not alone. There are things happening that people need to know about. Please don't give up." There was no explanation, no details, but the message was clear. Someone believed there was more to uncover. The homeowner folded the note carefully and placed it in a drawer. They weren't sure what to do yet, but they knew they couldn't ignore this. Later that afternoon, a small group of neighbors gathered at the park to talk about forming a resident committee. The homeowner wasn't sure if they wanted to join, but they decided to listen anyway. People shared their concerns openly now. Someone mentioned that their request to see past meeting minutes was denied without explanation. Another said their simple landscaping request had been rejected. Despite being allowed for years, one resident shared something more serious. They said they had overheard two board members arguing outside the community office late one evening. They didn't hear the whole conversation, but they caught a few words like audit, complaints, and risk. The group fell silent for a moment. "What do you think they meant?" someone asked. "I don't know," the person replied. But it didn't sound good. A woman sitting on a nearby bench spoke next. "I think they're worried. They didn't expect anyone to question them. Yesterday shook them." The homeowner felt something shift inside them. For the first time, they realized that asking questions wasn't causing trouble, it was helping the community. Later in the meeting, one of the neighbors suggested that someone should reach out to past board members who had stepped down. Maybe they would know why the changes happened, why things felt different. Another resident brought up the idea of requesting an external audit, something the community was allowed to ask for if enough residents agreed. The homeowner listened quietly. They weren't used to being in the center of anything. Yet now they found themselves surrounded by people who looked to them with respect. When the meeting ended, a woman approached the homeowner with a concerned expression. "I don't want to scare you," she said gently, "but be careful. The board doesn't like being questioned. They've shut people down before." The homeowner felt a knot tighten in their stomach. They didn't think the board would go after anyone directly. But the way things had been happening, nothing felt impossible. "Thank you," they said softly. "I'll be careful." That night, the homeowner lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Everything they had heard replayed in their mind: the unfair notices, the ignored questions, the uneasy glances from the board, the rumors about finances, the anonymous note. What started as a simple request for clarity had grown into something much bigger. They didn't know how far this would go, but they sensed that something important was unfolding, something the neighborhood had ignored for too long. The next few days were filled with quiet tension. People still talked to one another, but now their conversations carried a sense of purpose. There was talk of preparing a list of questions to bring to the board, talk of requesting documents, talk of gathering signatures. The homeowner felt the weight of it all, but they also felt strangely hopeful. People were coming together. People were supporting one another. One afternoon, while checking their mail, the homeowner noticed someone standing by the community office door. It was the same board member who had driven past their house earlier. He looked startled when he saw the homeowner. "Can I help you?" the board member asked, his voice stiff. The homeowner shook their head. "Just getting my mail." The board member nodded slowly, then said, "You caused quite a stir at the meeting." The homeowner felt a flicker of unease. "I only asked for clarity." The board member's expression tightened. "Some things are handled internally. Residents don't need to question every decision." With that, he walked away, leaving the homeowner standing there with a sinking feeling. What was he trying to hide? The days passed, and the community prepared for another meeting this time. Residents planned to attend in even greater numbers. The homeowner knew they had to be there too. They weren't the loudest person. They didn't like confrontations. But they also understood something now. Sometimes staying silent was more damaging than speaking up. On the night before the next meeting, the homeowner sat on their porch, watching the quiet street. The houses looked the same as always. The feeling in the air was completely different. Something was coming. Something that would change everything. And the homeowner, once just a quiet resident with a simple question, was now right in the middle of it, whether they wanted to be or not. The next morning felt strangely quiet in the neighborhood. It was the kind of silence that made someone feel like something was shifting underneath everything, even if they couldn't see it yet. The neighbors, who usually stood outside chatting near the mailboxes, kept glancing toward the street, where the small group had gathered the night before. No one said anything out loud, but it was clear that the word had spread. The homeowner at the center of it all stepped outside early, hoping to avoid curious stares, but the moment the door opened, a few blinds across the street moved slightly, as if people were checking whether more drama was coming. They tried to ignore it, and focused instead on the small tasks of the morning: watering the plants, sweeping the porch, placing new house numbers that complied fully with the HOA's rules. There was something calming about simple chores, especially after the tension that had built in the past few days. But even while working, their mind kept going back to the moment when the HOA finally realized they couldn't push any further. Something had shifted in that moment. It was like the homeowner and the neighbors who stood beside them had drawn a line that could finally be seen. They kept replaying the look on the HOA board members' faces when they realized they would have to answer for their behavior. As the morning went on, one of the neighbors who had joined them the night before walked across the street. He had a quiet way of speaking, someone who usually stayed out of arguments, but last night had pushed him to speak up too. Today he looked thoughtful, maybe even curious. "You okay?" he asked. The homeowner nodded. "Yeah, just a lot to take in. I didn't expect so many people to stand with me." The neighbor smiled a little. "You're not the only one who's been dealing with this. Last night was the first time people felt brave enough to show it." That made the homeowner pause. They had suspected that a few neighbors were frustrated too, but hearing it said out loud made it feel bigger. It's more real. The neighbor leaned on the railing. "You know, the board members, they've been getting away with too much. Everyone knows it. That's why people showed up. They were tired of feeling like they had no say." It was strange to think about. For so long, the HOA had acted like a strict force no one could question. But now that people had stepped forward, the image didn't feel as strong as before. Before the homeowner could respond, another neighbor walked up, then another. Soon, the small porch felt a little crowded, and they all seemed to want to say something not just about last night, but about things that had been bothering them for months. One neighbor mentioned the way the HOA had fined her for leaving her trash bin out for 10 extra minutes, even though she was helping her kid get ready for school. Another talked about being warned because their garden hose wasn't rolled the right way. Someone else mentioned getting a notice for a decorative flag that had been hanging outside for years. It became clear that people weren't just frustrated, they were exhausted. They had accepted rules that didn't feel fair simply because they didn't want trouble. The homeowner listened quietly, taking in every word. It felt strange to suddenly be at the center of this small gathering. They had never been someone who wanted attention, but now they realized that maybe this wasn't about attention at all. It was about something larger: fairness, respect, being treated like a neighbor instead of a problem. The group talked for almost half an hour until someone noticed a car slowly approaching. It was one of the HOA board members driving past but clearly watching the group. The car didn't stop, but it slowed enough that everyone's eyes followed it. No one said anything until the car turned the corner. "They're nervous." Someone whispered, another nodded. "They should be." A quiet determination settled over the group. Whatever had happened last night wasn't just a moment, it had started something. Something real. Later that afternoon, the homeowner received a message requesting that they attend a special meeting with the HOA board. They stared at the words for a long time. The note claimed it was simply to clear misunderstandings, but something about it felt different. It didn't read like the usual firm, commanding tone the HOA always used. This one felt almost cautious. When the neighbors heard about the meeting, they insisted on coming along. "They don't get to pressure you alone." One of them said, "We're all affected by this," added another. Hearing that made the homeowner feel both nervous and supported. Before all this, they could never imagine neighbors standing up for each other like this. Now it felt like a small team was forming around them. When the time came, they all walked together toward the small community building at the end of the street. The sun was beginning to set, creating a warm golden glow over the houses. It made the walk feel heavier, like something important was waiting ahead. Inside, the HOA board members were sitting behind a table. They looked more stiff than usual, as if unsure how to start the conversation. The homeowner sat across from them, the neighbors forming a quiet wall of support behind. The board president cleared his throat. "We wanted to address the events of last night." The homeowner didn't respond right away, waiting for them to continue. "There seems to be confusion about some of the rules, and..." One of the neighbors stepped forward. "There's no confusion. You made up rules that aren't written anywhere and used them to pressure people." The president paused. Taken aback by the interruption, another board member tried to respond, but their voice faltered when they saw how many neighbors were standing behind the homeowner. The homeowner finally spoke. "We're not here to fight. We just want respect. Real rules are fine, but being targeted isn't." Silence fell over the room. The board seemed unsure how to handle a situation where they were outnumbered, not in force, but in calm, steady unity. Finally, one of the board members sighed. We may need to review how we've been handling things. It was the first real sign of change. Not a promise, not an apology, but a crack in the wall they had built around themselves. As the meeting went on, the neighbors continued to speak up, each one sharing stories they had been too afraid to talk about before. Slowly, the board began to realize that this wasn't a single complaint. It was a neighborhood full of people tired of being treated unfairly. By the end of the meeting, the board agreed to review old fines, rewrite several unclear rules, and create a better process where homeowners could speak openly without fear of retaliation. It wasn't everything the group hoped for, but it was a strong start. When everyone walked out of the building, the air felt different, lighter, almost relieved. The neighbors gathered outside, talking and sharing small laughs. Even in the soft evening light, their faces looked brighter. The homeowner looked around at all of them and felt something they hadn't felt in a long time. Not fear, not frustration, but belonging. And they knew the story wasn't over yet. Part 4 had changed the neighborhood's direction entirely. But something bigger was still coming, something no one expected. The days that followed felt strangely calm, almost like the neighborhood was taking a deep breath after being tense for too long. People who normally hurried into their houses after work now lingered outside a little longer. Small conversations started happening near the mailboxes, on front lawns, and along the sidewalk. For the first time in a long while, community felt like an actual community. But even with that new sense of comfort, the homeowner felt something else growing beneath it: curiosity, maybe even worry. The HOA had agreed to review their behavior, but that didn't mean the story was finished. Change didn't come that easily, and everyone knew it. Still, something about the last meeting had opened a door. The neighbors who once stayed quiet were now sharing their experiences openly. They talked about small things at first, then bigger incidents, moments when they felt pressured, misunderstood, or treated unfairly. One afternoon, while the homeowner was sweeping the porch, a couple from the next street walked over. They had heard about what happened from their friends and wanted to share their own story. They explained how they had received 3 warnings in a single week for issues that barely made sense: one about a flower pot, one about a fence, and one about their car's parking angle. It always felt like someone was watching us for no reason, they said quietly. But last week when you spoke up, it gave us hope. The homeowner didn't know how to respond at first. They weren't used to people looking at them like someone who started something meaningful. They had only wanted fairness. They had only wanted to be left in peace, but now it was bigger. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the homeowner sat outside with a few neighbors who had become unexpectedly close over the past days. They talked about small things, work, funny moments from the week, but beneath all of it, there was an unspoken understanding that something had changed between them. Everyone was more connected, more aware, more willing to stand together. Then, just as the conversation was winding down, someone mentioned receiving an email from the HOA. What kind of email? The homeowner asked. It's about the board, the neighbor explained. They're calling for a community vote. They want to add new people to the board and change some positions. That made everyone sit up a little straighter. A vote meant a major shift. A vote meant the board realized they couldn't continue the way they had. A vote meant power was moving back into the hands of the community, the neighbor continued. They said they want more voices involved, more fairness, more transparency. The homeowner leaned back in the chair, looking up at the dimming sky. They hadn't asked for anything big. They hadn't planned any of this. They simply stood their ground, and somehow it had created a wave. Over the next few days, the vote became all anyone talked about. People discussed who they thought should join the board, what changes they wanted, and what rules needed to be rewritten. The community building, once overlooked and rarely used, suddenly felt alive again. People went in and out, asking questions, reading documents, and helping others understand the process. The homeowner's name came up more than once as someone people trusted, someone they believed could make a difference. But every time someone suggested they run for a board position, the homeowner shook their head. "I'm not trying to take over anything," they said with a small smile. "I just want fairness. That's all." Most neighbors understood. They didn't press. But the idea lingered in the air like a quiet thought no one wanted to chase away completely. When the day of the vote arrived, the neighborhood looked different than usual. Cars lined the street. People walked in groups toward the community building. Children ran around the grass while their parents signed papers inside. It felt more like a gathering than an official event. Inside, the atmosphere was surprisingly warm. No one felt intimidated. No one felt watched. People chatted, smiled, and helped each other understand the ballots. The homeowner stood near the back, watching it all unfold. They felt an unexpected emotion, pride, not in themselves, but in everyone around them. For the first time, people weren't acting alone. They were acting as one. When the voting ended, the board announced that results would be shared later that evening. People went home feeling hopeful, something that had been missing for too long. As the sky turned dark, the homeowner sat on their porch again. A soft breeze brushed through the trees, carrying the sounds of laughter from a few houses down. It felt peaceful. Then their phone buzzed, a message from the HOA. They took a deep breath and opened it. The message announced the new board positions, and it became clear immediately that things had changed. Half of the old board had been replaced. Several neighbors who had spoken up during the meeting now held positions, and the tone of the message felt different, warm, respectful, almost grateful. At the end of the message was a short note. "We appreciate the community's involvement and look forward to creating a more fair and welcoming environment for everyone." The homeowner read it twice, letting the words sink in. They hadn't expected this. Not so soon, not so fully. It felt almost unreal. A knock at the door pulled them from their thoughts. When they opened it, a small group of neighbors stood there, smiling. "You saw the message?" one of them asked. The homeowner nodded. Another neighbor stepped forward. "This wouldn't have happened without you." The homeowner shook their head gently. "It wasn't me. It was all of us." And that was the truth. No single person changed the neighborhood. The people did. They stepped outside onto the porch, where more neighbors were gathering, cheering quietly as the news spread house to house. Children were playing, adults were chatting, and for the first time in a long time, the air felt free. Someone handed the homeowner a small cup of lemonade. "To the start of something better," they said. The homeowner looked around at the warm, glowing faces of the people who lived just steps away. People they barely knew before all of this, but who now felt like a real part of their life. They raised the cup. "To all of us." The group cheered softly, clinking their cups together as the night went on, and the sounds of laughter and conversation filled the street. The homeowner sat back and watched. The confrontation that had once felt like a burden had become the spark for something none of them expected: a stronger community, a fairer neighborhood, a place where people finally felt heard. And in the middle of it all, the homeowner felt something simple but powerful: peace. The HOA confrontation had taken a turn no one saw coming, and it turned into something better than anyone imagined.